side outside his art. He was the most beautiful human being you could ever meet. Really.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, another question would be, would you move to Paris?
No.
Okay. Is there any other place that you would live other than New York City?
No.
Very good. And lastly, I would like to ask you, who was your favorite model or muse?
Mine? Or
Yes, yours. Yours.
Oh.
You as an artist.
Iman, Naomi. Those are my two.
All right, very good. And would you ever draw Pat Cleveland?
Oh, goodness. All right. Yes, we've spoken about it. And I would be floored too. I mean, that thing's probably going to make me insane. But after Antonio has drawn Pat Cleveland, how could I touch that? How could I even, I think I would fall apart. Yeah, it's like, I'm not going to redraw the Campbell soup can, you know. This is the ultimate goddess for an illustrator. And he epitomized it. So I don't know, but I will try, but I'm going to need a lot of coffee and...
Do my daughter.
Yes. Both. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Alvaro. Alvaro is known for his generosity. Questions, of course, for the panel, and we'd like to ask the brothers, what exactly inspired the book? How did you have done the Stephen Sprouse book, which is a jewel, we have that, but also, what in particular about Antonio or about his artwork inspired you to do this book?
Well, we were always fans of Antonio's work, and we're much older than we look. And so growing up as fashion students in the 70s and 80s, we really couldn't get away from Antonio. He was very, very present in every fashion magazine, European, American, ad campaigns, everything. He had his hand in everything and really inspired us to go into the fashion industry. And again, it was sort of, you know, I think I touched a little bit about it, but, you know, when we work with young designers now, and you know, we tell a designer, like, oh, what you're doing looks very Stephen Sprouse, or it looks very Antonio Lopez, or it looks very Giorgio St. Angelo. These are all people who died before the internet age, and unfortunately they're not as celebrated as they really should be. So while you see their influence out there, kids nowadays can't specifically pinpoint where they found it, or where it originated. So for us, you know, doing Stephen Sprouse was starting that, because if I saw one more iPod commercial that was ripped off of one of Stephen's graphics, I was going to flip out. And then Antonio was just the second logical book for us, where it's someone who, you know, has touched everything in our lives, especially fashion. And, you know, we just wanted him to get the recognition he deserved.
That's excellent.
But I think we need to talk about them, because they were in Paris with Antonio doing all of this, and as much as crazy looks, yeah, as much as Antonio influenced the world, these two were, you know, the engines behind it.
We will, if you promise to later, I'm going to revisit you and ask you to explain totally about Mao PR and Mao Magazine.
Okay.
The audience knows it, but they would like to know lots more about it, because it's really, really fantastic. All right, let me ask other questions here. Was it difficult? There's such an extensive archive in regard to Antonio's work, and you worked with Paul Karanikos in regard to augmenting the photography. How did you know? How did you decide to edit? It's difficult.
The way we edited it was insane. Basically, everything was in a warehouse in New Jersey. We spent the entire summer there. There was no air conditioning. It was like 90 degrees. It was horrible. And basically, we just went through every single piece. I mean, we would open up a box and there would be like 2,000 Polaroids of Grace Jones. We'd open up another box and there'd be 1,000 Polaroids of Pat. It was insanity, the amount of work that they did. And it was not only illustration, it was photography. They collected photos of the girls that they were friends with whenever they would come out in a magazine. So there were boxes and boxes of all the tear sheets. I mean, everything. And we went through everything. And then we had to pick the most iconic works to be in the book. But then we also wanted to include a lot of other pieces that were not in previous books and had never been seen before. And The importance to us was to show that Antonio's illustration and his life worked hand in hand. So the people that he was hanging out with in the 60s reflect how he was illustrating in the 60s. The people that he was hanging out with in the 70s reflected the 70s, and what he was doing with them reflected what the work was. So we broke it down into 60s, 70s, and 80s, and we edited it that way. 50% illustration, 50% photography, and then we re-edited and re-edited and re-edited to get where we are.
But also, one of the things that was very important for both of us is we wanted to do a book on Antonio that would appeal to a younger generation. We actually got a lot of flack for using this cover because Antonio is known as an illustrator. And we know that no one in their early 20s is going to even pick up a book that has a fashion illustration on it because it's really not relevant to their culture right now. So when we were looking at the images, it would be like, okay, that's a really great one, but is someone who's 23 years old and goes on style.com every day and you know, looks at today's American Vogue and today's Italian Vogue and watches Lady Gaga videos, are they going to think this is as fantastic? And if the answer was no, we would scrap it. And we had enough in the archives that we could actually be pretty liberal and stringent upon, you know, using this rule. But, you know, when you walk into a bookstore right now and you see this book, it pops out. Of all the books that are out there, this image really pops out at you. And while this may not be the most expected Antonio image, the whole idea of walking in somewhere and it jumping out at you is what Antonio was doing. So for us, it was really, you know, we know that fans of Antonio were going to buy this book. We were really catering it towards people who didn't know who Antonio was, and they have a different mindset, and you know, and they're watching Lady Gaga videos. So what is going to shock them, you know, from seeing this book? And that's how we selected a lot of the images.
My first recollection of Antonio was I was teaching at the Yale Art Department in Connecticut, and my mother showed me some of the Antonio drawings in the New York Times. At the end of the semester, I quit Yale and zoomed to New York City, only to get 2 hours of teaching at FIT. I was thrilled out of my mind. He was that big an influence on me. Do you remember the first time that you were aware of Antonio? What was the first
I was at school. I was at FIT.
Oh, okay.
I was taking Saturday Life courses, which were, I guess, for high school students on Saturday.
Yes.
I don't know, do they still have it?
They do, absolutely.
So, so I took illustration, and the very first day of class, I had a teacher called Sheila Hanser,
Yeah.
and she's still there?
Just retired, but yeah.
And she put Antonio photographs all around the room, like we're supposed to draw like that, you know? And she said, this is what fashion illustration is. And that was the first time I saw it, and it was, you know, and she had the real newspaper clippings from the 60s.
Yes, very, very good.
You know, tape them up and show them.
I totally love that. That's a good story.
Yeah.
I might have been down the hall teaching.
Probably.
I had black hair. All right. Let's see, what was the last photo of the illustration by Antonio on record? Photo or artwork?
You know what? It's actually an illustration that Susan Barrett, who was Antonio's first muse. She's in most of the pictures, most of the illustrations in the 60s are of her. And when Antonio was dying, there was a treatment in LA, and she lived in LA. So, so he went to LA and stayed at her house for a couple of months. And just before he died, he asked her for a pen and paper, and he drew an illustration of her. And that's the last known illustration we know about.
Is there a present-day artist that you, a fashion illustrator, that reminds you of Antonio's work in a sense?
No, not even close. No one.
Oh, that's serious.
There is.
We're going to hold and draw. Okay. Do you, if Antonio were present today, do you believe that he would probably be involved in digital media or drawing with the stylists?
I think he would love digital media, especially when you look at the work from the 60s, and he was using all that cello tape and you know, things that were kind of new to art directing back then. As soon as the Instamatic camera came out, he was one of the first people to buy it and utilize it. So he was very, very current always in exploring medias and using new technology at the time. So I imagine he'd be photoshopping like nuts right now.
I think I agree